My supervisor stopped me in the hallway on a Tuesday morning. Not in her office, not through an email. Just right there in the corridor outside the break room with two other colleagues walking past us, and asked me why I had taken an Uber to the company retreat last weekend instead of driving the lease vehicle assigned to my role. I remember the exact expression on her face, not accusatory, just genuinely confused, the kind of confused you get when something doesn't add up on a spreadsheet and you're trying to find the missing column. I opened my mouth. Nothing came out, and before I could even pull together an answer, my husband, who was standing 3 feet away because we had just run into each other near the coffee station, the way married couples who work at the same company sometimes do, smiled at my supervisor and said, very calmly, "Oh, the car is with my brother right now. He needed it for a few weeks." My supervisor looked at him, then at me, then back at him. She said, "That vehicle is assigned to Haley's position. It's not available for personal use." He said, Righto. It's just temporary?" She nodded slowly, the way people nod when they are deciding whether to push on something or let it go for now. Then she looked at me and said she'd like to circle back later that afternoon, and she walked away. I stood there next to my husband in that hallway and I felt something I hadn't let myself feel in a long time. Not anger, not embarrassment, something quieter and colder than either of those things. I had known on some level for months. I just hadn't let myself know it all the way. I should back up because none of this makes sense without the part that came before it. My name is Haley. I'm 31 years old. I work in operations management for a mid-sized logistics company in the Atlanta metro area. I've been with the company for 6 years, and 4 years ago I was promoted into a senior coordinator role that came with a company lease vehicle. A practical sedan, nothing flashy, but it was mine to use for work-related travel and commuting. The lease was in the company's name. The insurance was through them. My responsibility was to keep it in good condition and available for any business use my department required. My husband. I'll call him my husband because that's what he was then. His name is Garrett. He works in the same company, in a different department. He manages a small team in the vendor relations division. We met there actually 5 years ago at a company happy hour, and I thought he was charming and funny, and the kind of person who made everything feel a little lighter. We got married 2.5 years ago. Small ceremony, 30 people, a venue outside Athens with string lights and his whole family crowded into the front rows. His family. That's something I need to talk about. Garrett has 2 younger brothers and a sister, and from the very beginning of our relationship it was made clear to me, not in a stated way, but in the accumulated weight of 100 small moments, that family came first. His family. His mother's opinion was the final word on most things. His brothers could call at any hour, and he would pick up. His sister, Jolene, was the youngest, and had, by the family's accounting, the hardest life of anyone. Jolene is 26. She has a toddler, no co-parent in the picture, and she was working part-time at a nail salon in Marietta when Garrett and I got married. I genuinely liked her at first. She was warm and funny, and she remembered little details about your life in a way that made you feel seen. The car situation started about 8 months into our marriage. Garrett came to me one evening while I was making dinner and said Jolene was having trouble getting to work. Her car had broken down, some issue with the transmission, and she couldn't afford the repair right now. He asked if she could borrow my company vehicle for a couple of weeks while she figured something out. I told him the car wasn't mine to lend. It was company property. I explained that I was liable for it, that the terms of my position required it to be available for business use, that if something happened to it while someone else was driving it, I would be the one responsible. He said I was being rigid. He said family was family. He said 2 weeks, that's all. I said no. He didn't speak to me for 3 days. When he came back around, he was warmer, more affectionate, and he dropped the subject entirely. I thought the matter was settled. I thought I had held my ground. What I didn't know, what I found out much later, was that while I was at a 2-day work conference in Savannah the following month, he took the spare key from the drawer in our kitchen and gave the car to Jolene. By the time I got back, the car was in our driveway again. He never mentioned it. I never knew. That became the pattern. Whenever I was away for work, overnight trips, conferences, a few longer regional visits, the car would quietly disappear and then quietly return. I did notice at first because I was tired and busy, and because when you trust someone, you stop auditing the small things. The first time I actually registered something was off was when I noticed a fast food receipt in the passenger seat from a location on the other side of the city. I mentioned it to Garrett. He said it must have been from the parking valet at some event I'd forgotten. I believed him, because that was the easier thing to do, and because I didn't yet understand what I was dealing with. The second time, I found a child's crayon, a broken, half-melted orange one, wedged under the driver's seat. Jolene had a toddler. I held the crayon for a long moment and told myself there was a reasonable explanation. I told myself this the way you tell yourself things when you're not ready to stop telling yourself things. The third time, I got a call from the company's fleet management coordinator asking why the vehicle had been seen outside a residential address in Marietta 3 times in the past month, during hours I was listed as out of office. The coordinator said it was probably nothing, just a routine check-in, and I said, of course, I'd look into it. I went home that evening and asked Garrett directly. I said I needed him to be honest with me. He looked at me with this particular expression he had. Patient, slightly sad, like I was a person prone to misunderstanding. And he said I was creating problems where there were none. He said the fleet coordinator was being overzealous. He said I was letting stress from work make me paranoid. And then he said, and this is the part I have turned over in my mind more times than I can count. He said, I thought you trusted me. That sentence is a closed door. There is no good answer to it. If you say yes, you drop the subject. If you say no, you become the problem. I dropped the subject. What I didn't talk about as much, even to myself, was everything else that was happening alongside the car issue, because individually, the pieces seemed manageable, and I was very good at managing things in pieces. Garrett and I were at the same company, different departments, different managers, no direct reporting relationship, but the company was small enough that our professional lives overlapped at the edges, shared all-hands meetings, cross-department projects, occasional overlap in vendor communications. I had been working toward a director-level role for about a year. My supervisor, her name is Sandra, had been mentoring me through the process. I had strong performance reviews. I had led 2 initiatives that came in under budget and ahead of schedule. Sandra had told me, in a one-on-one, that she was planning to advocate for me in the next promotion cycle. And then, quietly, things started to shift. I wasn't included in a cross-functional meeting I should have been part of. A project I had been spearheading got reassigned to a colleague without explanation. My last performance review, which had always been strong, came back with a new category of feedback, concerns about my communication style and stakeholder management, things no one had ever raised before. Sandra still seemed to support me, but she seemed constrained in a way that was hard to articulate, like there was a conversation happening above her that she wasn't fully able to share with me. I didn't connect any of this to Garrett. I just thought I was having a hard season at work. It was my friend Patrice who said it out loud first. We were getting dinner one Friday, and I was venting about the review, and she put down her fork and said, Haley, your husband works there. Could he have anything to do with this? I told her that was absurd. Garrett and I were in completely different divisions. She said, that doesn't mean he doesn't talk to people. I drove home that night and sat in the driveway for 20 minutes. The hallway conversation with Sandra happened on a Tuesday in March. By Thursday, she had asked me to come to her office. She was careful and professional, the way good managers are when they're telling you something uncomfortable. She said the fleet management team had flagged the vehicle again. She said there was a pattern of the car being used at times and locations inconsistent with my work schedule. She said she wasn't accusing me of anything, but she needed me to explain what was happening. I told her everything. I told her about Jolene. I told her about the spare key and the crayon and the receipt and the call from the coordinator. I told her I'd confronted my husband and been told I was paranoid. I told her I was sorry and that I had not authorized any of this, and that I understood if the company needed to take action. Sandra was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that I didn't expect. She said, Haley, I think there's more going on here than the car. She had been wanting to talk to me, she said, for a while. She told me that several months ago someone in the building had come to her with concerns about my performance, expressed informally in a hallway conversation, the kind that doesn't get documented but does get remembered. The person had suggested that I was struggling, that I might not be ready for more responsibility, that my judgment had been off lately. That person was Garrett. He had gone to my supervisor, and framing it as a concerned spouse sharing a private worry, had planted seeds of doubt about my competence. He hadn't filed anything official. He hadn't done anything that could be pointed to directly. He had just talked, just shared concern, just been a husband who was worried about his wife. Sandra said she hadn't known what to do with it, and it felt inappropriate, but she hadn't been able to identify exactly what policy it violated. And because she is a fair person, she had watched more closely, and what she had seen was a high-performing employee who showed no signs of the problems her husband had described. She had been confused. Now she was starting to understand. I sat across from her desk, and I felt the room go very still. I thought about all the promotions I had been passed over for, all the projects I had been quietly edged out of, all the moments where I had felt myself slipping in the eyes of people who mattered, and had blamed myself, my stress, my communication, my readiness. It had never been me. I want to tell you that I went home and packed a bag that night. I want to give you that version of the story, but that's not what happened. What happened is that I went home and made dinner and sat across the table from my husband and watched him talk about his day, and I said almost nothing, and I thought about everything. I had a joint checking account with him. I had a lease on our apartment that had both our names on it. I had built a life in the city partly around his family and his connections, and I was realizing, sitting across that dinner table, how deliberately that had happened. I called Patrice that night from the bathroom with the fan on. I told her what Sandra had said. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Okay, we need to be smart about this." Patrice had been through a difficult divorce 3 years earlier. She understood the mechanics of disentanglement better than I did. She said before I did anything visible, I needed to know what I was working with. Over the next 2 weeks, I started quietly looking. I requested my own credit report, just mine, not our joint accounts. What I found made my hands shake. There were 2 credit cards in my name I had never opened. One had been opened 18 months ago, the other 14 months ago. Together they carried a balance of just over $11,000. The billing address was a P.O. box I had never heard of. I photographed everything. I saved the documents to a cloud account with a new email address Garrett didn't know about. I talked to a family law attorney. Her name was Ms. Chen, and she was calm and methodical and treated me like I was capable of handling the information she was giving me, which I needed desperately in that moment. Miss Chen told me the unauthorized credit cards were a significant issue, potentially criminal, depending on how the charges were used. She said I should report them to the card issuers as fraudulent, which I did, and file a report with the FTC, which I also did. She walked me through what Georgia law said about marital property, about the lease, about our joint accounts, about next steps. She also told me to stop using the company vehicle until the situation was formally resolved, and to inform my employer of the full picture so they could document the chain of custody. I went back to Sandra the next day and did exactly that. Sandra was grateful, I think, to have the full story. She said HR would be opening a formal review of the car usage. She said, without saying it directly, that Garrett's informal conversations about my performance would be part of the record now. I want to tell you what that moment felt like. The morning I finally left, I had arranged everything in advance, a storage unit for my things, a moving company for a Saturday when Garrett had a family thing in Gainesville and wouldn't be home. Patrice took the day off work and helped me carry boxes. I had found an apartment, a 1-bedroom in Decatur, on the 2nd floor, with windows that faced east. The lease was in my name only. I remember standing in the empty living room of the apartment Garrett and I had shared, taking one last look before I walked out. I had loved that apartment when we moved in. I had picked the paint colors and hung the shelves and chosen the plants on the windowsill. I had believed, when we signed that lease, that I was building something permanent. I looked at the plants. I took them with me. I texted Garrett from the parking lot of my new building after the movers had gone. I kept it short. I told him I had moved out, that I had filed for divorce, and that all further communication should go through my attorney. I turned off my read receipts and put my phone face down on the counter. He called 9 times in the next hour. I answered none of them. The divorce took 8 months. The credit card fraud was the cleanest part. legally speaking. Once I filed the fraud reports, both issuers launched their own investigations. The charges, dining, clothing, electronics, 2 separate hotel stays, were traced and documented. Garrett denied everything at first. Then he said he had opened the accounts with my knowledge. Then he said it was a misunderstanding about joint finances. The court did not find his explanations compelling. I was relieved of responsibility for all $11,000. He was ordered to repay the full amount to the card issuers and was referred to the county DA's office for review of potential fraud charges. Whether those charges were ultimately filed, I genuinely don't know. By the time that process concluded, I had stopped following it closely. The apartment went to me. We had both been on the lease, but I had paid the deposit from my own account before we were married, and Ms. Chen was very good at her job. The company vehicle situation was resolved with HR. It was documented that I had not authorized the personal use, that the vehicle had been taken without my knowledge on multiple occasions, and that I had self-reported once I became fully aware. There was no disciplinary action against me. There were consequences for Garrett within his own division. I don't know the specifics, but I know he was placed on a performance improvement plan and moved to a different floor. The promotion I had been passed over for came through 6 months later. Sandra advocated for me. I accepted. There are things I know now that I wish I had understood sooner. Gaslighting is not a dramatic thing, most of the time. It doesn't look like scenes from a movie. It looks like a patient expression on someone's face. It looks like, "I thought you trusted me." It looks like being told you're paranoid so many times that you start to perform certainty because you can't afford to look like you're falling apart at work. The thing that saved me, the actual turning point, was a crayon and a receipt and a fleet coordinator's routine phone call. It wasn't a grand confrontation. It was accumulated small evidence that I finally let myself look at directly. I also want to say something about Jolene, because she was part of this story, and she is a real person. I don't know how much she knew about what her brother was doing. I don't know if she knew the car wasn't his to lend. I know she needed help, and I know her brother gave it to her in a way that cost me significantly without her having to see the cost. I have no anger toward her. I have a lot of complicated feelings, but not anger. What I have anger about is simpler than that. I have anger about the 2 years I spent doubting my own performance reviews, my own competence, my own instincts, about the energy I spent trying to be a better employee when the problem was never my work, about the version of myself who stood in that hallway and couldn't answer a simple question about her own company car. That version of me deserved better. I try to remember that. I have been in my Decatur apartment for 14 months now. The east-facing windows are as good as I hoped. I have added more plants. I am, apparently, a person who collects plants when given adequate windowsill space. And I have a cat named after a character from a book I read the summer I was 22, which feels right somehow. I got coffee recently with a man I met through a work event. His name is Joel. He is quiet in the way that means he's actually listening, and he asks follow-up questions. And when I mentioned, vaguely, that I had been through a hard few years, he didn't push for details. He just said he was glad I seemed to be on the other side of it. I am on the other side of it. I don't tell this story because I want sympathy, though I understand if you feel it, and I appreciate it more than I can say. I tell it because I spent 2 years thinking the problem was me. And if you are somewhere in the middle of your own version of this, I want you to know that the problem is probably not you. The evidence is usually there. The small, accumulating, easy to explain away evidence. Give yourself permission to look at it. That's the thing I would go back and tell myself. Not in that hallway with Sandra. Not in the attorney's office. Not even when I was loading boxes into the storage unit. I would go back to the moment I found the crayon under the seat. I would tell myself, look at it. Just let yourself look at it. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this happened, not in a mystical way, just in the plain, observable way that actions have consequences, and the consequences don't always arrive on your timeline or in the form you expect. Garrett made a series of choices. He chose to take a key that wasn't his to use. He chose to lend something that wasn't his to lend. He chose to walk into my supervisor's office and quietly, carefully, with the language of a worried husband, begin dismantling my reputation at a company where I had worked for 6 years. Each of those choices felt, I imagine, small and manageable from where he was standing. Private. Contained. He probably believed he was operating in a space where no one was watching closely enough to connect the dots. But things don't stay contained. That's the part I keep coming back to. The fleet coordinator made a routine call. Sandra asked a simple question in a hallway. A crayon sat under a car seat and waited for me to find it. None of these were dramatic interventions. They were just the ordinary mechanisms of reality doing what reality does, accumulating, surfacing, refusing to stay buried. What I had to reckon with afterward was my own role in the timeline, and I don't mean that in a self-blaming way. I spent enough time blaming myself for things that weren't my fault. I mean it honestly. I saw the receipt. I saw the crayon. I heard the coordinator's voice on the phone and felt something shook to my stomach, and then I chose to believe the easier explanation because the harder one was going to cost me something I wasn't ready to lose. That's what I'd call a failure of courage, not intelligence. I knew, somewhere below the surface, before I let myself know. And the months I spent in that gap, between sensing and admitting, those months cost me. Not in any way I can't recover from, but they cost me. What I want to say about intelligence is this. Being smart doesn't protect you from this. I was good at my job, I had strong reviews, I could run a logistics operation under budget and ahead of schedule. None of that made me immune to slowly doubting my own instincts when someone I trusted kept calmly telling me my instincts were wrong. Intelligence without trust in yourself is just a tool someone else can use against you. And what I want to say about integrity, Garrett's, and the lack of it, is that it showed up eventually in every direction. A person who will quietly sabotage the people closest to them will eventually sabotage themselves. He walked into that hallway and answered Sandra's question with a confidence that could only come from never believing there would be a reckoning. That confidence was his undoing. It always is. Patris asked me once, after everything was settled, whether I was angry. I told her I had been, and that the anger had mostly burned itself out into something more useful, a kind of clarity about what I'm willing to accept and what I'm not, and how quickly I'll act on that the next time my gut tells me something is wrong. I am 31 years old. I have a good job and a promotion I earned, and a one-bedroom apartment with east-facing windows and more plants than any reasonable person needs. I have a cat. I am having coffee with someone who listens when I talk. This is what the other side looks like. It's quieter than I expected, and that's exactly right.